And then another situation, there was a proposal in Jackson County for a tax credit for the Ford Motor Plant. A sales tax increase in Jackson County. Separate, this is totally separate from the Ford Motor Plant. But they had on the ballot a proposal to increase the sales tax in Jackson County. Again, not our issue, but one of our Missouri Right to Life members that lives in Kansas City saw the full language of that and said, did you know that that tax increase is going to be used to fund research? And of course, it does not exclude research that involves human cloning and the destruction of human embryos. So again, we had to take a position and alerted our friend Bishop Finn in Kansas City to this, and the Catholic Church of Kansas City came out against this sales tax increase, as did Missouri Right to Life, and that measure was defeated. Missouri Right to Life basically has to review every proposed bill to make sure that there's no hidden money going to life-destroying research, because our experience with these two examples is that they're going to try everything they can to get tax money to fund this research. With good pro-life legislation, we not only want to close every abortion clinic and make abortion illegal in Missouri, we want abortion to be unthinkable. For the next part of our presentation, I'd like to introduce Jim Cole. As Liza said, Jim has served pro bono as legal counsel for Missouri Right to Life since 1995. Prior to that, he was chapter chairman and state president and served in many other roles for Missouri Right to Life. And he has been very reliable and very confident, has given us great confidence in our position on legislation because of Jim's insight. He's been instrumental in writing pro-life legislation, advising legislators, and educating the general public on life matters. Father, I hope you won't think this is blasphemous, but at Missouri Right to Life, when we say WWJD, we mean what would Jim do? Jim is also St. Mary Victory's nominee as Catholic Man of the Year. So I'd like you to welcome our legal counsel and good friend, Jim Cole.
Thank you, Pam. I don't know what to say in response to that kind of introduction. I will say, though, that early on, a lot of these successes that Pam talked about, I wasn't really involved in writing the legislation in the 1980s and the late 1970s that resulted in the Supreme Court decisions that Pam mentioned. There were a lot of people involved, and there still are. It's not like Missouri Right to Life is the only legislative right to life organization in the state. We're the one that's statewide. We're the one that focuses on pro-life issues only, and we're the most effective. But we have help a lot from the Missouri Catholic Conference. We got to give them credit for some of this work. We got to give credit to other good pro-lifers who work in Jefferson City. So I don't want anybody to leave here thinking that either Jim Cole or even Missouri Right to Life is the only power or the only influence on the legislature. But I will say this: we are the biggest and the most dedicated and the most effective. And I'm proud to be General Counsel for Missouri Right to Life. It's a very, very great privilege for me to do that. I'm going to be talking about an initiative that's going to be on the ballot, I believe, in November of this year. They're collecting signatures for this initiative already around the state, and I saw some news article recently that said they're confident they're going to get the number of signatures they need to put it on the ballot. So you'll be hearing a lot about this. It's initiative number 2020-063. Excuse me. I'm coming off a cold. I hope I sound all right to everybody. I don't have coronavirus. I haven't been exposed to it. So thank you. Thank you. But if at any point people can't hear me, signal me somehow so that I can either speak up or speak more clearly. But the gist of the initiative is the expansion of Medicaid coverage for an additional 100 to 200,000 people here in the state of Missouri. And the problem with the initiative is it has a number of pro-life concerns. I'm going to describe those in a few minutes. It really takes a lot of description to get into the depths of it, but we will have a summary that I've worked up in the materials that you'll receive. And you'll receive the text of the initiative, which is a one-page long text. You'll receive a copy of what is going to appear on the ballot, which is just a summary of the text, and then 3 pages worth of comments that I've made on different features of them. I'll go through what those are after I describe a little bit about the background of what Medicaid is. Medicaid is a financial partnership. It's a partnership with the federal government and the state government. The federal government came up with it in the 1960s. Every state has signed on to be a partner with the federal government in it, but the federal government makes the rules. Most of the rules are not made by the state, even though the state has to submit a plan every year to the federal government for approval to get Medicaid in place. The plan has to meet with federal specifications and has to be approved by the federal government. And I don't know of any way a state could pull out of that agreement now. And we've had over 50 years of every state being in Medicaid. It pays a lot of health care costs. Generally, it's a good program, but it does have some features that I'll get into that are bad. And to expand it the way it's being expanded here in Missouri has some particularly egregious features that even the federal government doesn't require. So let me jump into a few of these. One of the features of Medicaid is that it depends on tax money, but it's not limited to whatever is appropriated by the legislatures. It's an entitlement program. It's not a regular government program. The entitlement part of it is that whatever qualifies as a medical cost to be paid under Medicaid has to be paid for, whether or not the state has the money to pay for it. The courts will enforce this by making states contribute and taking money away from other things in their budget if they have to. The entitlement is the part of the patient and the caregivers who are supposed to be paid. And the federal government usually funds a majority share of what is billed to Medicaid. In Missouri, the share is roughly 2/3, maybe a little bit less. And then the state pays the rest. The last fiscal year we have figures from, the state paid about 23% of Medicaid costs out of the state general treasury, that's general taxes. And then another 20-some% was paid for by local taxes or by taxes on hospitals and other providers, and a slew of other miscellaneous tax-raising entities that contribute to Medicaid under some kind of special deal. It's very complicated. But the upshot is that the federal government pays the majority of the cost. The federal government is not limited to balancing its budget. So if they need to fork over more money for Medicaid, they borrow it by selling more bonds. And every year, in the last few years especially, we've had $1 trillion plus deficits of the federal government. Well, we're still running because Chinese and Arabs and other foreigners are buying our bonds. But if they stop buying our bonds, we're in trouble. But the federal government isn't under the gun to pay for Medicaid because it can do that. State governments can't do that. State governments, in every state that I know of, have in each state constitution a provision that they have to they have to spend no more than what they've paid, than what they've gotten in. The state of Missouri certainly has that. The governor is instructed by the state constitution to reduce expenditures if state revenues don't come in sufficient to pay for the state's bills. So Medicaid can bust a state's budget because we may not have appropriated enough to pay for our share of Medicaid in Missouri, but we're going to have to pay whatever comes in and qualifies, no matter what, and the federal courts will enforce that. Big difference between Medicaid and other programs because of that. The initiative would add working age adults without children who are below certain income requirements to be eligible for Medicaid. Right now, adults who are of working age who are custodial parents of children and fall below certain income levels qualify for Medicaid. But adults who don't have children who aren't custodial parents are not qualified for Medicaid unless they fall way down to about 22% of the federal poverty level. And that's a very low amount of money. Federal poverty level in 2020 for a single person is $12,760 this year. They raise it every year. 20% of that is not very much money. So you have to be really, really poor to be an adult who doesn't have children and qualify for Medicaid. But on the other hand, there are other programs available for people like that, and that's the working age of people. We expect them, by and large, to be able to get jobs. And most of the adults of that age are covered by employers' insurance, as I understand it. But there are a sufficient number of people out there who aren't covered by Medicaid and fall under the income guidelines of this new initiative, which would be 138% of the federal poverty level. That they want to try to add them to Medicaid, and that was the goal of the Obamacare law back in 2010, was to put all these people in Medicaid. In fact, they were going to force it on the states. The states sued in the Supreme Court, sued in federal courts, and the U.S. Supreme Court said they don't have to do that. It's unconstitutional. It just goes too far to force states to add all those people to the Medicaid rolls. But now they're trying to do it state by state, by constitutional amendment and by laws. Missouri and Oklahoma have initiatives this year that look very much the same. So I'm pretty sure they're written by the same people. To add all these people to the Medicaid rolls. In 2018, 3 states had initiatives and approved the initiatives to do that. 1 state did not approve it. So 4 states had all had elections. The 1 state that didn't approve it had a mechanism for increasing taxes to pay for the extra costs. The initiatives in the other states, and the initiative that we're facing now, has no mechanism for how Missouri would pay the extra costs of adding all these people. And it's a substantial increase in people. We have 976,000 people on Medicaid in Missouri right now, out of a population of 6 million. That's quite a few. There's 1/6 of the population already gets Medicaid. They want to add between 100,000 and 200,000 more. There's a substantial disagreement among the people you read on how much money that's going to cost. And the main trouble is that whatever it costs is going to come out of the state treasury, while any additional benefits are going to go to hospitals, to doctors, and to providers. It'll be up to the state treasury to figure out where we're going to get the money to pay for these extra people. And that's the one thing they aren't, it's one of the many things I think, that they aren't telling people as they advertise for first signing signatures to get this initiative on, and secondly, then to approve the initiative later. Excuse me. The packet will have, like I said, the text, but there are 2 sections of the proposed constitutional amendment. And this is a constitutional amendment. It would amend the Constitution of Missouri, not just enact a law like the legislature would. The significance is our Medicaid law right now is not part of our state constitution. The legislature can change it, so long as it meets federal requirements. And there's some optional things that the federal government has that states can choose to do or not do. There's a package of benefits that every state has to provide for their citizens under Medicaid, and then there are optional things. But those are all part of ordinary statutory law or federal law. They want to put this part that I'm talking about into the state constitution, where the legislature can't touch it. In other words, it would be frozen into the Constitution of Missouri. State legislature might see the need to change something, couldn't do it. And that's a problem in a couple of ways. But the first subsection out of 6 that's a major problem is the fact that they're going to add all these people to the Medicaid rolls, and they're going to receive coverage for the health benefits service package that everybody's entitled to. There's another part of it that raises real problems for pro-lifers, but also for other people. That's subsection 4. That says the Department of Social Services shall take all actions necessary to maximize federal financial participation in funding medical assistance pursuant to this section. In other words, written into the Missouri Constitution will be a requirement that we enact programs and pursue medical reimbursement that maximizes the cost of Medicaid to the federal government. Now, when you're talking about reimbursing expenditures, a lot of times, it's not very responsible to encourage maximizing expenditures. And one of the reasons it's irresponsible, especially in this context, is if you maximize what the federal government pays, you maximize what the state has to pay also. Because remember, there's a percentage that the state has to pay. If I'm a new grandfather the last couple of years. If when my grandchildren now become 18 or 19, I want to help their parents buy them a car. Now I could go to one of my sons and say, well, I'll pay 60% of the cost of the car. You pick out the car. And then you pay the other 40%. Well, is my son going to act responsibly if he says, hey, Johnny, let's get a Cadillac. We can maximize the number of Grandpa's dollars that we get this way. Well, no. You're not only going to maximize what Grandpa has to pay, you're going to maximize what Dad has to pay. That's exactly the situation that we face in this Medicaid bill, in this initiative. By maximizing the number of federal dollars, we force the state to spend more money than the state may choose to pay, and we can't do anything about it. I'll get into a couple examples later. That's the very first problem. That's not even pro-life, that's across the board. So, one of the problems with putting all these people on the rolls that are adults is that Medicaid forces the government to pay for family planning. And in government speak, family planning means artificial contraception. They don't pay for the natural means of family planning that the church agrees with. Along with that, there's a special section of the federal regulations that says Medicaid will pay for family planning that includes medicines to prevent implantation. Now, we know that human life begins at conception. What a lot of people don't know is that implantation occurs a full week after that. Implantation is not one fertilized egg that suddenly finds itself in the womb and implants there. There is no such thing as implantation of a fertilized egg, like you hear a lot of people say. By the time after conception that implantation occurs, the baby has grown to over 100 cells. It's all wrapped up very tightly so that it can get through the fallopian tube. And so it's kind of like the shell of a pill that you take. It's kind of hard, but then it melts in your stomach. It's called the zona pellucida, and it forms at conception to keep other sperm away from the ovum, so that you only have one sperm fertilizing one ovum. It forms then, and then division takes place beginning about 24 hours later. By the time the baby has reached the womb where it can implant, it's over 100 cells, and it's already, they call it hatching, like an egg, hatched out of the zona pellucida. It's ready to dig in and get the nutrients it needs from the womb. There are these so-called morning after pills prevent implantation in large part. Now some of them prevent conception itself, and that's not abortion. But you can't tell that there's a certain percentage of time that they work by preventing implantation, by reducing the nutrients and reducing the thickness of the wall of the womb that the baby implants in. And when you have a conceived baby, a week old, they can't implant. And the cause is because of some drug, then you've got an abortifacient. You've got an abortion. Medicaid pays for this right now. You're going to expand the base of women who are able to obtain payments for these drugs by X amount of 100,000 to 200,000 total population. That means that a lot of these women are going to get Medicaid payments for abortions that are medical abortions. And you don't even know when it happens. because it happens so soon after conception. But it happens, and there are good scientific studies that say that it happens. So the first thing that this expansion does, it supports the medical abortions of the so-called morning after pills. That's a big problem. Secondly, excuse me, it may have an impact if the Hyde Amendment is ever overturned. And we've been living with the Hyde Amendment for a number of years. Henry Hyde is a hero. It's his amendment that Congress enacts, but they have to enact it every year as a rider to appropriations bills. Our Congress, in the first 2 years of the president's term, was led by Republicans in the Senate and the House. Of course, we had President Trump in the White House. They were unable to make it into a permanent law. One of the biggest failures of the last few years in the pro-life movement. So we still have the Hyde Amendment has to be enacted each and every year. Well, guess which party in 2016 announced that the end of the Hyde Amendment is one of its major goals? And guess which party had a number of candidates in 2019 and 2020 that announced that they were full square behind getting rid of the Hyde Amendment? And guess which party had a former vice president running, who's still running, and who has voted for the Hyde Amendment as a U.S. Senator for 36 years? And he was roasted over the coals, to coin a phrase. But he was roasted over the coals for his votes back then, and he had to denounce his own votes in order to keep competitive in the Democratic primaries for president. Now, we can't stand on the basis of the last 40 years of history when a major political party is dedicated to overthrowing the Hyde Amendment as soon as they get into some power. So the threat to the Hyde Amendment means this: not only will there be Medicaid surgical abortions paid for even if this initiative doesn't pass, they figure about 300,000 across the country, a few thousand for Missouri, but we'll expand the base of the number of people who are eligible for those when we expand the number of women who can participate in Medicaid. And so it could as much as double the effect of the end of the Hyde Amendment if we enact this initiative. I think that's a big problem. It's been said that if you turn loose a bunch of crack lawyers to defend pro-life positions, then the end of the Hyde Amendment might be fought at the state level. That's dead on arrival. You know, Missouri has a law already. It has had a law since the 70s that has a tighter version of the Hyde Amendment than the federal Hyde Amendment. Missouri in the 70s enacted a law that said Medicaid will pay for surgical abortions only if they're to save the life of the mother. There's no rape and no incest exception. The federal Hyde Amendment carries a rape and incest exception as well as life of the mother. In 1979, the federal court struck down the Missouri law. It said it's unconstitutional. Or not, I'm sorry, not unconstitutional. It's illegal because it violates federal Medicaid law. You have to remember, the federal courts, or not the federal court, but the federal statute, the federal Medicaid law, trumps anything the states say in their Medicaid provisions. So because it violated the Medicaid Act, as passed by Congress, Missouri's restriction on paying for surgical abortions was too strict and couldn't stand. Well, since then, the Hyde Amendment itself went through a few changes. And under President Reagan, the Hyde Amendment actually matched Missouri's law. But under President Clinton, another small Southern governor who became president, President Clinton started attacking the Hyde Amendment as soon as he got into office. And they went back to a compromise of life of the mother, rape, and incest. And at that point, the feds came to court again. And we're under an injunction that was already passed, an injunction imposed on the state of Missouri in 1994 that said we cannot enforce any law tighter than the Hyde Amendment under Medicaid. And so Missouri's law has been declared twice unconstitutional, or I'm sorry, in violation of the Medicaid law, because it's tighter than that. So it's a pipe dream to think that if the Hyde Amendment goes, that we can enact any kind of protection. The federal courts have already taught us twice, specific to the state of Missouri, that we can't do that. And there are a slew of Court of Appeals decisions from all over the country, including the Court of Appeals that handles cases from Missouri, that say the federal Medicaid law controls and you can't do anything about it as far as restricting abortions. So that's a lesson that we ought to learn when it comes to the Hyde Amendment. Just a couple more things here. I'll talk about the maximizing federal financial participation in the Medicaid program. In 2016, Missouri was participating in something called a waiver program for women's health services. A waiver program is a part of a Medicaid plan in which the federal government waives certain specific requirements that the federal government is allowed to waive under the Medicaid law in order for some innovation to be tested in a particular state. And Missouri had an innovative women's services program that it had as a Medicaid waiver and began clear back in 2006 or 2007. Well, in 2016, the legislature put a rider on the state appropriation law that said Missouri will not pay any abortionist any money under this appropriation. And that includes the money appropriated for the waiver law, the state share of that. Well, the federal government knocked on Jefferson City's door and said, by the way, that offends the Medicaid law. You can't disqualify a class of providers like Planned Parenthood just because you don't like what they say and what they believe in. The only way you can disqualify them is to show that they can't competently perform the services that they're engaged to perform. That hadn't been done in 2016. We hadn't reached the point of having the lawsuit here in St. Louis that's gone to the Administrative Hearing Commission, for instance. So the state was in a box. The state legislature had told the Department of Social Services, you can't pay any money to Planned Parenthood, it's an abortionist. But the federal waiver provision allowed any provider